And then I will stop sharing, Jack. And if you would like to take over, then we can get started on GameMaker.
Thank you very much, Luke. Let me just get set up here. Okay, so as a little introduction, I have been familiar with GameMaker for a while. It started back when I actually did a GCSE in GameMaker, or to be more precise, it was a Edexcel ICT DIDA. So GameMaker has been around for a while. It's also been through several revisions, and we're going to be looking at the latest revision today. So this session is all about GameMaker. The one we'll be looking at is GameMaker Studio 2. Any questions for licensing? That's not really going to be covered in today's session. Today's session is more about getting familiar with the software and familiar with the content. So what is GameMaker? Well, GameMaker is a game engine. That means it's a piece of software that sits between the programmer, as the user, and the machine, and presents a friendly, easy environment for making games. Without game engines, we would be struggling to write games in binary or assembly language, and it'll be like trying to program games back for the Commodore 64. But now with game engines, it's much easier and anyone can pick it up. GameMaker is also an IDE, that stands for Integrated Developer Environment, and it's a standard piece of industry jargon. Basically, all it means is it's a piece of software that makes it easy to write code and make assets for designing games. It's a good introduction to some of the concepts used in the games industry and computer science in general. For that reason, GameMaker is very popular with indie developers, independent developers, but the larger developers tend to prefer more complex tools. So a couple of games that have been made in GameMaker, if you could pop your hands up if you've ever heard of Undertale. No? Undertale was one of the most popular games of 2015 that was produced in GameMaker. And it's quite likely that a lot of people will recognize that, as it's prominently featured on YouTube, people playing it. Other games made in GameMaker, well, we've got Hyper Light Drifter, which is praised for its visuals, and Spelunky. These were all made in GameMaker Studio. So what are we going to be doing today? Well, today we will be kind of making a game together. Our game is going to be a game called Traffic Control, and it's to promote road safety. And the reason why we're choosing such a boring topic is it's very in line with the WJC specification, which is all about choosing a topic with lots of data analysis and research in it, and then producing some kind of digital media product out of that. Our game will be a top-down 2D game that borrows elements from Frogger. The players will have to navigate a set of streets that kind of forms the shape of a maze. They have to avoid traffic, and the goal of the game is to reach the shops in each level in order to progress to the next level. So let's break down what actually makes up a GameMaker game. GameMaker is able to make games because of two important components of the engine. One of the most important components are the assets. Assets are the digital sound, music, image, background files that make up the game. So any digital file used in the production of the game. The specification is very heavy on the word asset, so it's good to get familiar with this and look at some of the things that can be produced. Next, we also have these other important component of GameMaker, which is the programming language. So without programming, our games wouldn't be interactive. In fact, they wouldn't really be games at all. GameMaker offers two programming languages. The first is GameMaker language, which we abbreviate to GML. And the second is drag and drop, or drag and drop, and that's abbreviated to D&D, not to be confused with Dungeons and Dragons. In this session and in our materials, we will be focusing only on GameMaker language. GameMaker language is a scripting language. It's very similar to JavaScript. It's a great introduction to programming, and it's very flexible and has many more features than drag and drop. And if you follow along to the official GameMaker tutorials from the developers Yo-Yo Games, even in the tutorials, it will say GameMaker language is the best choice. Drag and drop is a visual language, but it's unlike any other visual or block-based language out there. So if you are familiar with Scratch, it is nothing like Scratch. If you're familiar with MakeCode, it's nothing like MakeCode. It is completely unique to GameMaker, and because of that, it's got very little presence in the industry, and there is hardly any support for it online. So, whilst drag and drop is more visual and requires less typing, and there are no grammar rules, despite the sort of impression that drag and drop languages tend to be easier, I would argue that GameMaker's drag and drop language is nightmarish. So it's nothing like Scratch, it's very lengthy, it's harder to understand, and it does not prepare pupils for the realities of the industry. And we've got an example of it on the right there. That is quite a lengthy, lengthy program. Whereas if I were typing this out in GML, it'd be maximum of 5 lines of code. So for that reason, we're going to favor GML. So let's start having a look at the integrated developer environment, or the IDE. I have it open alongside me today. If you want to follow along, you can feel free to have GameMaker open on a screen alongside what you're watching here, or if you just want to sit back and watch, that's perfectly fine too. I'm going to start by creating a new project. So I'm going to click in the new option of getting started, and it gives you a choice straight from the start whether you want drag and drop or GameMaker language. And I still can't stress enough that GameMaker language is going to be simpler for you and simpler for your pupils. And it will ask you to set up a project folder. So it will get saved on the computer you're using, and it'll be saved as a folder. And that can be moved around and stored somewhere, and it's quite easy to move to other computers if they've got a licensed copy of GameMaker as well. I'm going to call this Traffic Control. I'm going to call it Traffic Control 3. Because I've already got Traffic Control 1 and Traffic Control 2, but you can give it a sensible name and go ahead and start. Now, there are 2 parts of the IDE that are the main focus of what you'll be working with. The first is the workspace, and that's this large area with the kind of blurred, mottled background. This is your workspace. Imagine it like the surface of your desk. If you're working on something, it gets opened up on here, and that's where you fiddle around with it and mess around with it. And you can drag around with the mouse and use, zoom controls and things like that. I will warn you, I have had problems using GameMaker on a laptop. It does have a laptop mode that you can switch on or off, but I found that just makes things worse, switching it on. I would really recommend plugging in a USB mouse if you can. I think it just makes it easier to use this interface. Over on the right, we have the next important part, which is the asset browser. And this is your basically a list of all the files that make up your game and files of different types. So you might have things like sounds, you might have things like fonts. We'll be looking at a couple of these today, but note that they are stored over there on the right and they can be accessed anytime by double clicking any item in here to open it up. Okay, speaking of the assets browser, let's have a look at the next part, which is all about the assets we're going to make in our game. Now, I've put together a little bit of a asset pack of image assets so that if you're not so confident with artwork, then you don't have to go ahead and make any art, or if you want to move ahead fast and not spend time drawing stuff, you can visit tc1.me/traffic pack, capital T, capital P. Feel free to use that in today's session to make any of make the game that we'll be working on. We are planning on releasing a more advanced graphics pack with proper licensing, so that might be of use to you later down the line, but that's something we will advertise separately. Okay, let's talk about the first part of GameMaker, and that is the sprites. So a sprite is an image that can be used throughout the game, any kind of image. A sprite can be animated, or it could just be still. They are stored in the sprites folder over in the asset browser, and you can create one by right-clicking on the sprites folder and clicking create. You have the option to load a sprite in from anywhere on your computer, or you can create your own. Now, important thing about sprites is they are measured in pixels. They have a width and a height, and that width and height is in pixels. And it is the designer's decision what resolutions you use. So how many pixels per row or pixel per column. So smaller resolutions are easier for pixel art, but larger resolutions offer more detail. So if you're making a game that's intended to be look like it's quite old-fashioned, maybe look like it came from the 80s, then you might favor pixel art. But if you wanted something that looked a little bit more swish and a little bit more modern, you might favor higher resolution sprites. Let's go ahead and create one together. So we'll need a player in our game, and we'll need an image to represent the player. So over in the assets browser, right-click on the sprites folder and then click create new sprite. I'm going to go ahead and do that too. I'm going to look over in the sprites folder in the assets browser. I'm going to right-click, hover over create, and then choose sprite. And you should see a window like that up here. Okay, next step. The next step is to give that a sensible name, and the specification goes on and on and on about sensible names. What do they mean by a sensible name? Well, they don't actually tell you. However, my impression of a sensible name is one that is easy to recognize if you're looking through a list of hundreds. So if I'm making a player sprite, I might want to actually call it player character or something like that. Now, the way we do that is in this window that opened up, there is a name bar in the top left, and I can type in a name there. Sprite1, which is what it's named it by default, is not a good name. because by the end of creating your game, you'll have sprite 1, sprite 2, sprite 3, sprite 4, sprite 100, and you won't know what any of them are or what they do. I'm going to call this player character with no spaces, because adding a space just causes issues. An example of a not a sensible name. However, one trick I like to do, and one trick I've picked up with GameMaker, is I like to put a little abbreviation on the end for what type of asset this is. And I just find that easier, because if the game breaks and there's an error, then if you know what type of thing caused that error, it's just much easier to recognize. So sometimes I like to put underscore SPR at the end if it's a sprite. Or I might just put capital SPR on the end if it's a sprite. I just find some indication like that just makes life easier. Okay, so the next step of creating a sprite is to decide the resolution, to decide how big the canvas you'll be drawing on will be. And remember that smaller values are good for pixel art, higher values are good for more detailed art. To change the size, there is a button over here on the left, which looks a bit like diagonal compass points. That's the resize sprite button. And clicking on that, it brings up a new menu. It's a very small menu, I'm afraid. I can't zoom in any more on that. But if you click on resize canvas over on the right-hand side of that, you get to decide how big your sprite is in pixels. Now, this depends on the style of your game, but I'm going to leave it at 64 by 64, actually, for this one, just because I think that gives me a nice balance between detail and ease of drawing. I'm best at pixel art, so I bear that in mind when I decide on the resolutions of my sprites. Okay, so once you've decided on a size, it will say W 64, so width 64, height 64. And it'll be different if you've got a different resolution. Now, one of the things that makes GameMaker quite powerful is it's got everything you need built into the IDE. So if we want to now draw our sprite, we can click Edit Image, and it will bring up the sprite editor. And this will actually let you draw things right then and there. So I'm going to do that. In the top left of this window that opened up when we created the sprite, we can click Edit Image. And we're now in the image editor. So if you're following along with me, feel free to let your artistic talents free, draw whatever you like. Remember, this is a game about traffic, so you might want to draw a lollipop person, you might want to draw some kind of character, a pedestrian maybe. You can use the tools over on the right. So I might start by drawing, let's just go boring stick figure. Give them a hat maybe, a green hat. That's my terrible stick figure lollipop person / wizard. Actually, that's terrible, so I'm going to cheat and go ahead and load one up I've already made. I'll be showing you how to load up previous ones, load up existing ones in a moment. There we are. Yeah, imagine I just drew that. This is the sprite editor. We've got lots of options in here. We've got options for animation, layers, and all that, but we're going to be looking at just the bare basics today. Once you've drawn a character, there is no save button you just close the editor. So at the top, you'll see that it's opened a new tab for the editor. We've got the workspace tab and the sprite editor tab. I can just go ahead and close that tab. And it will then show my sprite in full in this window. Anyway. Yeah, so you can use the sprite editor to draw our sprite and then close the sprite editor. Okay. Now, sprites are unfortunately just images. They can't interact with the game. They don't do anything. If we want the game to be interactive, we need objects. Objects are the part of the game that's actually interactive. Objects can take user input, so they can read the keyboard or read the controller. They can interact with the world. They can perform programmed actions. And it's inside objects that we actually write the code. Objects are invisible. So the only way they can actually be visible is if they wear a sprite like a cloak. And that means that for everything we want in our game, we need it to have a sprite. We also need it to have an object. A sprite for the image data, for the visual aspect, and an object for the programmable or the interactive aspect. Something to remember about objects, though, is they are like a template. That means you can have many instances of an object in the game at a time. So if I wanted to create a wall, I don't have a wall 1 object, wall 2, wall 3, wall 4, wall 5. Instead, I have one wall object and then multiple instances of that wall. That should become clear when we have a look at doing that later. But we're going to go ahead and create an object now. So yes, we will need a player object for the user to interact with. A player object that could do the running, the jumping, whatever that the game requires. It will take user input, and depending on the input, will move around. So to create an object, we need to go to the asset browser and create a new object in the objects folder. Let me go ahead and do that. So at the moment, I've got the sprite a menu open up on the workspace. I'm done with the sprite now, so I'm just going to close that window. And if we look over in the assets browser, we can see that the sprite is now there. This time, however, I'm going to single click on the objects folder. I'm going to right click, open create, and then create an object. It is possible to put certain assets in the wrong folder, which is a nightmare to solve. So make sure you're creating it in the right place. But with that created, you should see a window has opened up in the workspace. Okay. So after creating an object, again, we need to give it a sensible name. So I tend to call my player character object player character. It's quite imaginative. But again, I like to put a little indication that it's an object type. So I usually put the letters OBJ at the end or something like that. That's just a reminder for me if I'm looking through a list of assets. So over in this window that opened up where it says the name box in the top left, I can change that to player character. And I'm going to call this one OBJ at the end. Good question from Alex. If anyone's got any problems or struggling or wants to ask a question, feel free to put a virtual Zoom hand up or type a message in chat. I have a tendency of going a million miles an hour, so you can also tell me to slow down. Okay, so in the name, I've now given it a sensible name. Notice that it's a bad thing to have two things named the same thing. In fact, I even think it throws an error. Let's see. Yeah, if I have two things that are the same name, it won't like that at all. Every name must be unique. But as I said, objects need to wear a sprite to be visible. So we're going to give our object the right sprite to wear. So over in the object menu, in this sprite subsection, we've got a big option box where currently it says no sprite. If I open that up and navigate to the sprites folder, I can see my player character sprite is already in there. And as soon as I click that, it loads it in as whatever the object's going to wear. Okay, so we got it wearing the right sprite. Next, I've mentioned it here of changing the settings. Currently for this object, the player object, we don't need to change those. Although we do need to know where these settings are. So underneath the sprite submenu, you've got this menu called collision mask. And underneath that, you've got visible, solid, persistent, uses physics. At the moment, only visible is ticked, and we're just going to leave it like that for the one we've got there. I've got a question coming in who's asked, why is my sprite 96 by 96, whereas I originally set it to 64 by 64? Good question. I should have spotted that. Because I loaded in a sprite I'd already made, it overwrote that that resolution I'd set at the beginning. So I should have picked up on that. Yeah, and that's the only reason. But yeah, we'll be working on resizing things later down the line today. Okay. Sorry, beg my pardon. Sorry, forgive me. So we're going to head on to actually programming in GameMaker now. And if this is your first experience of a typed program language, don't worry, we're going to go through things step by step. And the first thing we're going to go through are the events. Events are the most important part of GameMaker. And it's to such an event that we actually classify GameMaker as an event-driven game engine. Events happen when certain conditions are met. So there is an event called create. Create happens when an object is first created. There's an event called draw. Draw happens whenever an object is drawn on the screen. There's an event called key press. That one happens whenever the user presses a key on the keyboard. These events are like triggers. So if we add runnable code to any of these events, that code will run when that event is triggered by the certain conditions. So if we add code to the create event, when the object is created, it will run that code we added. Let's go ahead and add some events to our object now to actually give our object some interactivity. So in our player object, we need to add an event that will trigger when we press a key on the keyboard. This will give us control of the character. It'll allow us to move the object when we press on the keyboard. So to do that, I need to look at this events window. The events window should open automatically when you open up an object. If it doesn't, however, you can click on this events panel, which is somehow minimized for some reason, you can click on this events panel down in the bottom of the object. And you should see this sort of daughter box on the side with a wire connecting them. This is your event list. This is where you add events to describe how the object will behave, given certain events. So let's click Add Event. It opens up a sort of sub menu, which is a little tiny on my screen. Apologies for that. But here we're going to add a key press event where when the player presses right on the keyboard, something happens. So the next step is we're going to set it to key press right. So add event, key pressed, hover over key pressed, then looking down that sub menu, I can find right. That refers to the right arrow on the keyboard. And as soon as I click that, it adds that as an event to my event list. Okay. Doing that has opened up the code editor for that event. This section on the right is where you type your code for that event. So anything that you want to run when that event is triggered. Now, for starters, I'm going to ask you to ignore the first two green lines, the one that says // at description and / you can write your own code. Ignore those for now. They're not really important to us today. As a little bit of an introduction to GameMaker language, as with any language, programming or human, there are several components and rules. We usually call these grammar rules. In this session, we'll be looking at some of the basics. If you want to explore more, you can actually find the documentation over at manual.yoyogames.com. Have I got that typed right? I have. No, I've typed that wrong. Please ignore that link. It's yoyogames.com. There we are. The second link is the correct one. In that, you can find a section called the scripting reference. That's where you can find all the components and information about GameMaker language. Now, the first component we are looking at are variables. A variable stores a value. That value could be a whole number, it could be a piece of text, it could be a decimal number, or it could be a Boolean, so true or false. We can set or change the value of a variable at any time using the equals operator. Now, GameMaker has many different types of variable. To start with, though, we'll only be altering built-in variables. Built-in variables are built into the engine. These are variables that are used behind the scenes by the engine, and some of them are present in every object, others are more general. Here's a couple of examples. So every object has a speed variable. This stores the speed of the object. Every object has direction. Every object has an X variable. Does anyone have any guesses as to what the X variable is? And what units it uses? No guesses so far. The X value, yeah, so someone's got it across. The X value of an object is the position of it horizontally across the screen in pixels. And that goes the same for Y. Y is the position vertically across the screen in pixels. That's some of the built-in variables that every object has. The engine has more general built-in variables. Like there's the room variable. The room variable stores what number room you're on. We're going to get onto that later. Now, some more general ones like score, health, room height, room width, or as I've written it there, room width, which is not a word. Now, we'll be using variables and we'll be creating statements with them. In computer science, a statement is a single line of code that performs an action. And one of the most basic ones out there are assignment statements.
Jack,
now, yeah.
Jack, sorry to interrupt. Can I just draw your attention to a question? Where is the origin?
Good question. By default, the origin is that's a two-angled question because every sprite has its own origin, and of course, the room itself has its own origin. Sprites by default have the origin in the top left of the image file. The room, I want to say, has the origin in the top left. I'm a little hazy on that because I've not really needed to think about that. But
can I add another question to that?
Of course.
In some computer programming languages, the y coordinate, when it increases, that goes down. In GameMaker, if you increase the y position, does that go up or down the screen?
I'll be honest, I can't remember.
Okay.
Yeah, that's one thing to maybe look at. The built-in variables that we'll be altering today kind of deal with that automatically for us. Anyway, like JavaScript and lots of other programming languages, GameMaker language ends all statements with a semicolon. So that's in line with C, that's in line with Java, that's in line with all sorts of very popular programming languages. So in the next section, we will type one line of code into the key press write event. And that line of code will be exactly as it's written here, direction, which is a built-in variable, equals, which resets the value to what we tell it to, 0, which is the value we want to set it to, and semicolon, which ends a statement. Now, does anyone want to guess what this line of code does? It's a built-in variable of the object, and then we're setting it to 0. What might it do? Someone says move right. Close. We're not actually moving it yet. People have said pointing. Pointing, yes, kind of. Not rotating, though. Someone suggested rotation. That's not the case. Direction equals 0 basically sets the what the direction of the object will be heading next. What direction will it go next? And that is to the right, because GameMaker counts direction from the right, starting at 0 degrees right, up is 90 degrees, left is 180 degrees, down 270 degrees. Why it does that, no idea. It's just confusing. And I always have to look this up. I can never remember it. But moving our character, we're going to do two things to actually make the character move. First, we're going to set the direction to right. Then we're going to set the speed. And we're going to do that with the speed built-in variable. We're going to set the built-in variable speed to 5. If you're already way ahead of me, have a go at thinking about what do I need to put in to get it to go the other directions. But for now, we're just going to do direction and speed for key press right. So I'm back over in the editor. I've got my key press right event here. I'm going to press enter a couple of times to give me some extra space away from the green text. And I'm going to type in direction. Now, as I type that in, you should see a box have come up. This is GameMaker trying to decide what it thinks you're typing out next. And if you press tab, it will fill in what it thinks the most likely thing you'll be typing next is. We can see in this box that it's listing some built-in variables for us, things like direction, temp directory, working directory, program directory. That's none of the ones we want. We just want direction, the one that's at the top. Ooh, not direction NB either. So direction equals 0, and I finish that with a semicolon. And then I'm going to press enter to bring me down onto the next line where I'm going to set the speed. Speed equals 5. And I finish that with a semicolon because it's a statement. Okay. So if you want to spend a moment doing that, whilst doing that, I'm going to start adding in the other direction. So a key press up, a key press left, a key press down. So add event, key pressed up. Anyone remember the direction for up? Yep, it's 90 degrees. So direction equals 90. Speed equals 5. Okay, let's add another event. Key pressed left. Direction equals 180. Speed equals 5. Now, if I were being lazy, I've got another option. I could just pick one of the ones that I've already written, and I could right-click, and I can duplicate the event. And when I duplicate the event, it'll ask me to choose what event the new event should be. So I'm changing this onto key press down now, and it copies across all the code for me. So all I have to do is change one number now. So that can save you quite a bit of time if you've got large segments of code. Now, you may notice there is a little asterisk next to the tab where it's got the code I've written for this event. You'll also notice that asterisk is at the top in the title of the program window. That just means I've got unsaved changes. So I can always go File, Save Project to make sure I've got everything saved and I'm not going to lose what I'm working on. And again, it's standard thing of pupils always forget to save. Sometimes you even have to find you shouting across the classroom, everyone save, remember to save, that kind of stuff. Okay. Oh, okay, Alex has done a little bit of research. The origin is the top left in rooms and sprites. Oh, excellent, thanks for finding out. So yeah, as an object goes down the screen, the Y value gets larger. And as the object goes right across the screen, the X value gets larger. Cheers for searching that up. Okay. Now we've looked at doing those, and we've got some of the other directions as well. Let's look into the next section, which is going to be all about testing. However, there is a little bit of an obstacle. We can't test our character movement until we have a room. Now, rooms are the levels of a game. And I say levels in quotation marks because not every game has levels. You might have a game that takes place all in one level. Rooms are more different segments of the game. So you might have a room for the main menu. You might have a room for a character's house. You might have a different room for the enemy's lair, that kind of stuff. A room contains all the objects, the backgrounds, the sounds that you want in a particular segment of the game. They start as a large empty canvas, and you can place these backgrounds and objects in that room. You need at least one room to actually run the game. And because of that, GameMaker has automatically created one for you called Room 1. So let's go and find Room 1. So in the Assets browser, you should see there is a folder called Rooms. In there, there is Room 1. Now, again, with the specification, there is emphasis on sensible names. So I would suggest renaming Room 1 to being the name of the level or something recognizable. So I'm going to right click on that. Actually, let's close down our player object because we've finished with player object for now. So I'm going to close that. I'm going to look in the assets browser, expand the rooms folder, and here I can find room 1. And if I right click on that, I can rename. That's open. Oh, I must have misclicked. That's open sprite. I'm going to rename. And I'm going to call this level 1. Again, I wouldn't say that's a particularly descriptive name, but yeah, it works for our case. So after doing that, you can double click it to open it up, and it opens it up in the room editor. The room editor is different in that it opens a whole new tab rather than opening in the workspace. So it has its own tab and area of its own. This is what you are greeted with. You get a large canvas with a grid as the background. The grid allows you to align stuff. You can disable the grid if you want to. We also get lots of panels over on the left, and the panels over on the left are quite important. The top panel is all about layers. We'll be looking at that in a second. The middle panel, I don't find that too useful. Sometimes I make that smaller because it's not very useful to me. But at the bottom, there is one of the most important panels. This is the properties panel. This is all the settings for your for this particular room. Now in here, we've got the option of width and height. Now at the moment, what numbers you type in there will influence how big the game window is on your computer. So if you look at your screen, and if you know the resolution of your screen, if you were to type the same number into the width and height here as the resolution of your screen, that would mean the game window will take up the whole of the screen. So for example, my screen is currently 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels tall. If I were to put that number in here, that would mean the game would take up the whole size of my screen. That can change, and it will change when we look at views. But for now, just be aware of whatever numbers you type in here will influence the size of the game on your computer. At the moment, it's currently set to 1366 by 768. I'm going to leave it like that. But be aware, if you go to an older computer with a slow resolution screen, the game will be massive. If you go to a newer computer with a 4K screen, the game will be tiny. So that's something to be aware of. Okay, before moving on to the next bit, there's a little extra step I'd like to add in here. At the moment, the background is completely black. If we want to lighten that up, we'll change its color. We can have a look over here in the layers menu. In the layers menu, we've got instances and background. And if we click on the background layer, we've got options for the background. Question, is there a way to read the viewport size of the computer automatically when setting the size? There is. So back when I introduced built-in variables, I said there was room height and room width. Well, at the start of the game, if you set room height equals screen height, I think, or a room width equals screen width. And if you apply some maths to those, you can get it to perfectly proportion with the size of the computer screen. I have to check up on that one. It'll be in the reference somewhere. But over in this backgrounds layer, we can actually set the color of the background. We could also give it a sprite. So that's how we can give visual detail to the background. But at the moment, I'm just interested in this color bar. So let's give it a horrible blue. Maybe not so bright. Sky blue, there we are. Okay. So for the next step, we're going to now go to the instances layer. And if you find that things aren't working, it's good to check which layer you're doing things in. The instances layer is where all the instances of objects are stored. So make sure you're on the instances layer. So let's do that. In the layer menu, I'm going to click instances and I am now there. Now, to get actual objects in the game, in the room, we can drag them into the game from the asset browser. So take a look down the asset browser to find the player object and drag it into the room. So over on the right, I've got player character object. In the objects menu, I'm going to drag it in. And now my character is in the room. I can pick it up and drag it other places. And so on. Okay. At the moment, all we've got is a player character in an empty room. That's just about enough that we've got to actually test the game. So let's look at actually running the game and testing it. To play the game in a test environment, we can click play. It's available on the top row, and it's a little play button. When you click play, GameMaker will compile your game. This is quite a lengthy process, and it can go wrong. The console will tell you how that progress is going. The console appears at the bottom as soon as you click play. Now, if you've made a mistake in your code, like maybe you've forgotten a number, maybe you've forgotten a bracket, you will find that mistake in the compile errors section of that console that turns up. If there is a mistake found in your code, the GameMaker ID will alert you to that using the compile errors tab. So let's give that a go, and fingers crossed there's no mistake in my game. So I'm going to click play up in the top here, click run. You can see output is going mad, mentioning a load of gubbins. Okay, it's opened up. It's opened up on my other screen. So let me drag this in. We've currently got a game. And if I press a right button, my character moves right, down, left, up, right, down, left, up, left, down, right, down, up, down, right, and then all sorts. And you'll see that as my character moves off the screen, that this is very basic and we've got lots of bugs here. One thing you'll notice is that you can let go of the key and it carries on moving, as if you're playing a game of Pac-Man. Now, depending on what game you're trying to design, maybe that's what you intend. Maybe you want it so that when you let go of the key, the character stops moving. It all depends on your preference, what you want as a designer. So I've got a little section here. I want you to consider some ideas for yourself, just whilst I refuel with a glass of water. So if you're running the game, have a go at these questions. If you're not running a game, then maybe reflect on these and see what importance they have to the testing process. I'd say this section is much more generic, not necessarily just for GameMaker. This is good for any kind of game design. So is the outcome what you got the same as you expected? How would a player who is not me feel playing this? Is that how you want players to feel? Are there any ways a player might break the game? I'll be back shortly. So these kind of questions are very useful when it comes to ensuring a game functions correctly and it's actually enjoyable to play. And it might be a good idea. The specification does mention creating a development log. It might be an idea to kind of reflect on things similar to this in that log. Okay, let's move on now to adding a little bit more to the game. So let's add some walls. Without obstacles, there's not really much to engage the player, especially in a maze game. And one of the most simple obstacles we can add are walls. So anyone want to suggest to me what components do I need to add walls to the game? What two GameMaker components? We've got answer here, sprites and objects. Interestingly, someone suggested tiles. Tiles I will be talking about in the second session. But at the moment, we're just going to look at the sprite and object way of doing this. So let's go ahead and add one. This time, however, we won't be drawing it, we'll be importing it. The reason is that the specification mentions clearly that they must demonstrate a use of creating an asset or manipulating an asset externally. And for this, well, we can go ahead and import it from an external program. Okay, so I'm going to close the level editor for now. Don't need that anymore. I'm going to go back to my sprites, right click, create a new sprite. When you are importing a sprite or an image asset, you don't need to set the resolution. The resolution will be set automatically depending on the size of the image you are importing. So I'm going to call this my wall, SPR, my wall sprite. Actually, I'm going to call it house because in my game, the obstacles are houses in the way. So house SPR. Then I'm going to go ahead and click import. And I'm going to import something that I've made previously. I'm going to import this one called house simple. When you are importing something, it always comes up with this warning message. Importing files to a sprite is not an undoable action. Do you want to continue? What this means is if you've already drawn a sprite, as soon as you click yes, it will erase it and replace it with what you're importing. So I'm going to click yes because that's what I want to happen. And I've got a wall object. Now, if you're looking as to what we can actually make assets in other than the GameMaker sprite editor, well, there's plenty of options. One option is, I'd like to remind you that I believe that with a hub account, you can get access to Adobe Creative Cloud. And with that comes Photoshop, Lightroom, Adobe Animate, Adobe After Effects, all things that would be great for creating assets. It's also a personal choice though. Some people are more comfortable in certain editors, and you can have all sorts, even things like Microsoft Paint. In particular, my favorite is piskelapp.com. I find that good for creating sprite artwork, your pixel artwork. So it's all what works for you, what works with your school systems, whatever's available. But after importing, which I have done, well, let's finish up on that and actually go ahead and make the wall object now. So again, we're going to create the object, give it a sensible name, and then make it wear the right sprite. Okay, so that's my wall sprite. Don't need that anymore. Instead, I can just go to objects, right click, create object. Zoom in on this. At the moment, it's called object2. That's a terrible name. I'm going to call this my house object. And again, we need to make it wear the right sprite. So in the sprite submenu, I'm going to choose my house sprite. Now, before we close this, there's an added step here. What we're going to do is in the settings, we're going to make it solid. Now, the solid setting is quite useful for anything that is static. And if you actually hover over the solid tick box, it tells you what it does. If I tick that, solid instances will automatically be placed back in their previous position when in collision. All that means is that when I hit a wall, that wall won't go spinning off into the distance. It will stay where it is. So I'm going to tick solid because this is going to be my obstacle. Okay. We're not going to add any code now. Instead, we're going to head straight over to adding it to our level. So we're going to close down the object editor for that. So to add wall object to level 1, we're going to go to the room editor by double-clicking that in the asset browser to open it up. We're going to drag the object into the room. However, if you're making a pattern of lots of objects, particularly walls, it can get tiring if you're having to drag in every single one individually. So there's an alternative. You can single click it in the asset browser and then hold the right Alt button on your keyboard to paint with the mouse. I believe that is different on other devices. I'm using a Mac. It's right Alt on Mac. I can't remember what it is for Windows. So let's do that. Let's go to the room, double click to open it up. Here is my level. If I wanted to add some objects, I could drag them in. Oh dear, that's a bit small, isn't it? Well, we'll get on to fixing that in a second. So I could bring them in one by one, start making the walls of my maze, or I could single click it, hold right Alt, and I can start painting with them. Not very well, admittedly, but I'm going to undo that anyway, so it doesn't matter. Now, one thing you may have noticed there is adding in that object, we kind of got it in the wrong scale with the player. See, I was expecting this to be a lot bigger, so maybe I've set the resolution wrong. We could fix that in two ways. So we've got two options. We can either resize the sprite or we can resize the object. If you resize the sprite, it will update the size of every object that uses that sprite. However, if we resize the object, it'll only apply to one instance of that room. Sorry, one instance in that room. What I mean by that is if I click on my tiny house object, and I drag one of the corners, I can resize it. However, doing so will make it blurry when we actually run the game. And if you imagine having to do this for every single one of them you drag in, that's going to take a long time indeed. So instead, let's resize the sprite so that it updates all the objects at once. So let's close the level editor. Let's go back to the house sprite object and double click to open that. I don't need to re-import it or anything like that. Instead, I can go to the resolution button under image. And in this submenu over on the left, I've got option here to scale the image. We're scaling the image this time, we're not resizing the canvas. If I scale the image up to 128 by 128 pixels, that will be in the right resolution for what I drew the artwork in. So if things are too small or too large, you can change them there and scale the image. And now I can see that it's quadrupled the size of that. So if I open up the level editor again, and I grab my house object and I hold right alt to paint with it, I can see, yeah, that's getting much better. So I can actually get a little bit of a maze going on. Let's add space in there. Oh, one's outside the room. I'm going to delete that. So click to delete. And maybe that one comes around. And maybe let's have a gap here. It's very crudely done at the moment, but it's just a nice little demonstration, that's all. So now the sizing is much easier and better to use. Okay, let's test the game and see what it's looking like so far. Wait for it to load. Here's my game. What happens when I move? Well, I seem to move all fine, but oh, wait, hang on. I could go straight through these. There's something wrong there. I shouldn't be able to go through the obstacles. So that's the next part we're going to look at. We're going to look at adding collisions. So we've added our wall. We now need to add new behavior to our character so that that object knows how to deal with these walls. Collisions, however, are tough. They're quite difficult to program. So things like ramps, moving platforms, things like that require much more advanced code. Today, though, we're going to do something a little bit simpler. We're just going to set the player's speed to 0 when they touch a wall. So for that, we need to use a collision event. So let's go ahead and open up the player object. So I'm going to open up my player character object. And here we need to add a new event to the event list. I'm going to click add event. And I'm going to add a collision event. Now, a collision event occurs when any two objects collide. And here I can select which object the collision's happening with. So I've got it now so that when the player collides with the house object, I can do something. And here I'm just going to set speed equals 0, semicolon. All I'm doing here is I'm setting the speed of the player to 0 when there is a collision with a house. And that will stop the player from going straight through them. And let's just go ahead and test that, see if that works now. Okay, so I can still move around, but when I try and walk into a wall, let's see what happens. Oh yeah, the player now doesn't walk into the walls, doesn't walk through them, sorry. So now we're getting something that's a little bit more like a game. Now, you may notice that if I get the player to walk downwards, they just walk straight off the screen. Does anyone have any suggestions for how I could go ahead and fix that? What events might I use? Oh, I could just spill water all over my keyboard. Anyway, find edge of screen by screen size, then stop. That's a good suggestion. That's probably quite a good suggestion. However, I'm going to do that in a sort of more cheaty way. I'm going to use an event called intersect boundary. Intersect boundary is an event that will trigger when an object leaves a boundary. And a boundary could either be the edge of a view or an edge of a room. And the one we're interested in today is the edge of a room. So over in events of my player character object, I'm going to add event. And in the other sub-menu, I've got lots of other options here, like game start, room start, path ended. I'm going to use the one called intersect boundary. So other intersect boundary. And in that one, I'm also going to set the speed equal to 0 and see what happens then. So let's try and walk outside the world. Yeah, it doesn't happen. I can't leave the world anymore because as soon as I intersect the boundary, the speed is set to 0. The alternative solution is also to put your wall object all around the outside of the room, outside what the player is able to see. That's a nice, cheaper solution as well, although it can use quite a lot of objects if your room is very large. Okay, that's the bare basics of our game. We've got a maze to navigate. We've got a player to navigate it. Let's add a little bit of threat. We're going to add some cars now, and these cars are going to make the game more challenging. And the more challenging game is, the more rewarding it feels to win it. So again, we need to create a new sprite and a new object. Remember, if you're looking for sprites, you can find them in that asset pack I sent you at the start. There are several car objects in there, so you can choose between the blue car and a red car. Sorry, car sprites. I'm going to just create one, create a sprite. I'm going to call this car up. I'm going to import car up. Let's go car up red this time to contrast the background. Okay, that's a sprite made. Let's now create.
You want to put SPR at the end, Jack?
Oh, good. I nearly forgot my own naming convention. Car up SPR. There we are. Let's create the object as well. It's going to be car up obj, and it's going to wear the. No, it's not going to wear the house. It's going to wear the car. There we are. This one is not going to be solid because this is a moving vehicle. Making something moving solid tends to lead to bad physics and wacky bugs happening with your game. So if it's moving, don't make it solid. I'm just going to have car up object. We need to think about the behavior of this car. So when you design a game, it's important to think about these behaviors before even touching a keyboard. Companies like Nintendo create what they call a design document or a design Bible. These are huge 100-page documents detailing exactly how they're going to create the game before they've even created it. So planning is paramount. thinking about our car, we need to think about what it's going to do. And I've suggested these 3 things. I'm going to suggest that when we create the car, it chooses a random speed. When the car's also going to move up the room, and we're going to say if it leaves the room, it jumps back to where it started. Once we have that behavior planned, we can then begin deciding what events are connected to these. So looking at the first one, when create, well, that's obviously going to be a create event. Moving up the room, that's going to happen when the car is first created, so that's also going to be a create event. Leaving the room, well, we've already looked at one option for that. We've got intersect boundary, or there's another one there called outside room. So those are 2 options there as to events we could use. Now, before looking at the car code, there's another thing we need to consider at GameMaker, and that is the built-in functions. Now, like built-in variables, GameMaker has built-in functions. A function is a chunk of code that can be called upon at any time. Imagine it like an envelope. Inside the envelope, there are some instructions. If you hand the envelope to someone, they drop what they're doing and they follow the instructions inside. And once they've dealt with that envelope, they then return to what they were doing before they were given it. The grammar for a function is the name of the function is always followed by brackets. And some functions allow you to put numbers inside that bracket, inside those brackets, to give it something to work with, to calculate with. Now, for our car, we're going to use the built-in function random underscore range, open bracket, close bracket. This function takes 2 numbers and it will choose a random number between those 2 numbers. So we're going to have it. So in our create event, we set the direction of the car, and then we set its speed to something random between 1 and 4. Let's go ahead and do that. So I've got my car up object, and now we're going to add event. I'm going to add a create event. And here I can add that code I discussed. So direction equals 90, which if we remember is going up. Then we're going to set the speed equals random underscore range. And as you can see, as soon as I typed it up, the code window has given me the options of everything that matches what I've typed, what it thinks I'm going to be typing. That one is particularly useful for functions because it tells you how many numbers you can put in the brackets. And here for random range, well, we choose the lower limit, which is going to be 1, then a comma to show I'm going to the next number, and then 4, which is going to be my upper limit. And I'm going to close that bracket and finish with a semicolon. Okay, so that's the create event. Don't forget to save your program. I'm also going to add an intersect boundary or an outside room event. And here I'm going to set the X position and the Y position of the car to be X start and Y start. X start and Y start are the 2 built-in variables. These store the position of the car or the position of the object when it is first created. A question from the chat asking, can you delete the 2 green lines at the start of the code window? I can't say I've ever tried. So maybe give that a go and see if see what issues that causes, if any. But yeah, I'm going to add an event called outside room, and I'm going to set X equals to X start and Y equals to Y start. So add event, other, outside room, X equals X start, semicolon, y equals y start, semicolon. And let's click that and see. Oh, that stopped that game, actually. I was going to test the game, but there's no point in testing it yet because I actually haven't put the car in the room. If the car's not in the room, then I'm not going to be able to test it. So let's open up the room. And let's add the car in. So I'm going to drag the car in. Let's have it going up this street here. Oh, it's slightly off center, but we can fix that. Let's have another one here for added challenge. And now we can play. Oh, so bring this through. We can see that the cars are going up the screen, and when they leave the room, they return to where they started. And by the way that they are separated, we show that it's choosing a random speed. Okay. So for the very last thing that we're going to add to this game, we need some kind of goal. A game without a goal, they do exist, but you know, they tend to be a little bit more interesting, a little bit experimental. However, our game is not that. We are going to add a goal, and that's going to be a shop. And we're going to have it so that when the player hits the shop calls the code room_go_to_next. Remember, that's a function, so that ends with an open bracket and a close bracket. So if you want a little challenge, you can go ahead and add that shop as part of the game. It's part of the asset pack. I would actually recommend, I think I'm going to set this as homework. Add a shop to the game and maybe have a think about what you can do to make the cars more dangerous. If you want to spend 2-3 minutes looking at that, I need to jump off and fix something, but after that I will come back and take any questions. So I will see you momentarily.
Just to remind everyone, with these, everything we're going through today, we've actually got video tutorials going through this. So even if you haven't managed to follow along today, they'll be available. And of course, this recording will be available as well. So if you do have any questions, you could probably make the most of Jack now, because you can't ask questions for the videos that you'll be watching later on. So if you have any questions about GameMaker or making games in general, he's the person to ask. Don't try emailing me because I know a reasonable amount, but not as much as Jack knows. But if you do email me, I will find out for you. So, you know, you can email me if you want to. And just to find those video tutorials, we have a Technocamps YouTube account. We've started putting a lot more effort into that since things have gone virtual. So we've got quite a lot of activity packs and certain things, like video tutorials for various topics in computer science and just, you know, digitech related stuff in general. If you wanted to find the playlist for this, you just type in Technocamps GameMaker and they'll come up. I am working on the Welsh versions. They're taking me longer because I'm trying to learn this as I go and then translate in my head and say them. But we will keep developing these and making more as we go through this course.
Marvelous, thank you very much, Luke. In the meantime, does anyone have any questions that I can address? And it can be anything about GameMaker or game design in general, or the specification. Oh, and a little bit of an advertisement from Alex. Technocamps Bangor are now delivering face-to-face again. So if anyone wants to book a face-to-face workshop, they can go ahead and email Alex at that address there in chat.
If you're in North Wales and near Bangorish. So I guess the last thing for me, if you don't have anything else, Jack, and there's no questions, is I have made a poll just for feedback I hope I set this up right, but if you could just answer this poll when I launch it, just double check I've got everything I wanted. It feels a bit weird to do a poll after the first session of 2, but I thought maybe some people won't be able to make it next time, so we'd like to get feedback now. So if I just launch this, it's about 6 questions that are just multiple choice. If you could just answer those for us, that would be great. Oh, there is a question in the chat, Jack.
So, very good question. What level of complexity would we expect students to get to? It's hard to say. Game design is very much one of those topics where you'll get a certain percentage at the top of the class who just run off and create the next, Mario game, something that's amazing. You'll get others that follow the tutorials and the materials as close as they can and then just change the assets to make a different game. As for design, platformers are popular because that gives you lots of options for, lots of design options there. That is, doing a platformer is relatively easy to do once you've added gravity, which I believe we'll be looking at gravity in the next session. So platformers are definitely an option. Top-down adventure game. Basically, I think one of the things to promote here is the imagination of the pupil, because with the imagination, you can get lots of engagement. And if there's lots of engagement, it's likely that a lot of them will do further research, looking through the documentation and making some great stuff. There's more to remember, there's lots of tutorials out there as well. So it's good to encourage sort of more independent learning and looking at what there is available online.
And of course, the kind of games that they'll be able to make, it'll depend on whatever WGC release in the data that they are releasing, that they have to interrogate and analyze to inform their games or their animation. It might not suit, a maze game, or it'll depend on it. I think you can probably make a maze game about anything, really. But it'll depend on the data that they release every year. I was going to say something else as well then. Forgot what it was.
I've had another message about someone trying to run a drag and drop program earlier. Access to the Windows prompt. Okay, so I suspect if GameMaker is struggling during the compilation stage, the compiling part where the console goes up, it's probably calling on external programs to actually turn the game from a GameMaker project into something runnable. So maybe have a look at speaking with IT technicians to see what programs are running in the background to enable GameMaker to run that kind of stuff. As for advice, I'm afraid I don't really have anything other than looking at maybe running it on less restricted computers. That's terrible advice, I'm afraid, but it's all I can suggest. Another question on physics. A lot will want to add portal style physics. I'm a bit confused as to what that means. Do you mean teleporting players around, or do you mean portal as in the 2008 game from Valve? For the first part, if you want to do teleportation, that's as simple as in setting the X and Y locations. As for the game, for the physics in that, you can get a lot with the very basic gravity we'll be doing in the next session. However, you can get some really advanced physics stuff. And unfortunately, there is no way of implementing that nicely without kind of understanding the components of gravity. So you'll have to look at things like velocity and terminal velocity. What I usually do is I have something that checks if the player has reached terminal velocity, and if they haven't, adds on extra Y velocity going downwards until they fall down. And I think that gets a nice gravitational effect. But that's something to look at. As far as I could tell, there's no way of using external physics engines like Havoc or PhysX. I don't think you can do that in GameMaker. Question, are the slides on Teams or elsewhere? I believe they will be on Teams, and I believe there is another link that Luke sent out.
That's what I was going to say that I forgot. So now that the session has gone well and I'm happy with it, I'm going to translate the slides tonight. So I have a Welsh version as well, and I'll release them both either tonight or tomorrow in the Teams and in the alternative link. I think the intention is as well, we will be making additional resources to go with this. I think, Jack, you mentioned about kind of breaking down bits of the code so you have cards that we can kind of use as handouts when we go to schools, and we can share them with teachers as well.
Yeah, that's certainly a potential and potentially incoming. So keep an eye on the Teams, keep an eye on any announcements, and we'll let you know about stuff like that. Again, some lovely feedback. Thank you, everyone, for those comments.
I've got a question about exporting. I think we're covering that in the next session, Jack.
Yeah, so exporting can be quite tricky because it depends on what computer you're using. Obviously, exporting for Windows is different for exporting for Mac, which is different for exporting for web, which is different for exporting for mobile phones. So I will look at covering that in the next session, but I can't promise that'll be too deep. If you want to experiment with exporting now, if you look at the editor, in the bar at the top, there is a button next to save called Create Executable. Executable is the keyword there. It creates the file necessary for running the game as a program.
And just to add to that, WJC have been very vague with their kind of what they want with when they're exporting. Everything else seems to be something that you need to embed and actually run. So say the animation one we're looking at in the next sessions after GameMaker, they wanted it to actually run in the website, so you can embed it in a website. But then with GameMaker, they seem to say that they just want you to put an .exe file in the website. But then it gets confusing why you would need to kind of pay the license to get the HTML, so you can put it as a HTML embeddable game. So at the moment, we are going off the idea that we think WJC will require that you'll need to be able to have it embeddable, so a HTML format. But given from what's actually written in the teacher guidance, it says just to a .exe. So we're unsure about that.
Yeah, it's very confusing because that also sort of suggests that they will only want submissions from Windows computers, but I don't know. It's very vague at the moment. Okay, I think that's coming to the end of any questions. Think we're about ready to close down, Luke?
I think so. If there's no other questions, then thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. We will. We set homework, didn't we, Jack? They have to try and put a shop into a game if they've got access to it. And we'll release more video tutorials in the meantime ready for the next session, and I'll try and keep up with Jack with the Welsh versions.
Okay.
So I think that's all. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you at the next session.
Cheers, everyone, and hope you enjoy GameMaker.